Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on the 2019 Minnesota Student Survey. We're bringing this information to all of you in the hopes that you'll be able to use it in your communities to talk about the prevalence of sexual exploitation among youth in Minnesota. We've got with us today a number of fantastic people to talk about the data and what we learned and also what we're going to be able to do with it. So I will hand things off to Beatrice Menento from MDH to start.
Sure, I'll just give a quick introduction and I'll let everybody introduce themselves before we jump into the program. So my name is Beatrice Menento and I'm with the Minnesota Department of Health. I am the supervisor for our violence prevention programs unit. And this unit houses two programs. One is our sexual violence prevention program, and the other is our human trafficking prevention safe harbor program. And the work that was done and this information is really relevant for both of our programs to guide our work. So, Lauren?
Hello, my name is Lauren Martin, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Nursing at the University of Minnesota. I've been conducting community-based research on sex trading and sex trafficking in Minnesota, really just trying to understand kind of the roots of what's going on and really working with communities to surface knowledge. And I'm very excited to be here today to share some of our latest research working with the Minnesota Student Survey. I'm going to hand it over to Barb.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Barb McMorris. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm also an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, and Lauren and I are colleagues in the School of Nursing. The focus of my research is on the prevention of risky behaviors in adolescents, and really around the prevention of risky behavior. And I'll just say this is probably the first presentation that I've ever given while not wearing shoes, right? So everybody is working at home. Am I right about the fact that I don't know where my shoes are? So hello, everybody. We have a quick poll that we'd like to administer for you to fill out just to see who is attending the webinar so that we can see who we are talking to. Sarah, can you pop up that poll? So you could just pick one of those sector or profession. Which sector or profession are you representing today? And we can see how many people are answering. Looks like there's 74 of you here. Welcome. We're about halfway through, folks indicating what sector or profession you're representing today. Getting close.
Can I break in real quickly? I forgot to mention at the start, for folks, if you have questions or comments, please enter them into the Q&A and we will get to them. Most questions will probably save till the end of the presentation, but if you have clarification or if there's anything that you need to be kind of further explained, we can also do that within the presentation. So feel free to use the Q&A, the chat as well, but the Q&A is best for questions for presenters.
Okay. All right. You can end the poll and I think we can show the results. It looks like about half of you are from sexual assault or domestic violence programs. About 16% of you are from community-based programs. We've got a few folks from juvenile corrections, government agencies, prosecution, legal representation, and then a few from schools or educators. So thanks, everybody. We've got a better sense of who is in the room, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And I think you can go ahead and stop sharing the results of the poll, Sarah, and turn us off, and we'll bring up the slides so that Bea can talk first.
Yep, I'm going to share the screen now. And all right. Just okay. Can you see the slide there, Beatrice?
I can. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Just tell me when you want me to advance.
Sure. So, you know, I just want to say that I'm also really excited to be here. Thank you so much to SVJI and MINCASA for asking us to present. And thank you to the audience for joining us. I also want to, you know, just give the warning that I do have a 7-year-old running around. And so Of course, right when the presentation starts, chaos starts to ensue, but we'll see what we can do and get through. I want to thank the partners with the University of Minnesota School of Nursing who did this analysis, the Women's Foundation, Carlson Family Foundation for its funding, and the Department of Education are partners with the Minnesota Student Survey. So just to really emphasize that this is such a collaborative initiative and effort as well. Before we get into the details of the analysis and the findings, I want to, and I get to provide a little bit of context for this project. You can go on to the next slide, Lauren. And the context is about two factors. One is really providing the context for the state of Minnesota. I'm not sure how many of you are from Minnesota, but I believe we have some out-of-state people that I just want to give that environment and that understanding of where we are coming from, where we're coming in this work. But then also really framing this effort within the public health approach to human trafficking and exploitation. And we've been, we know and we hear the phrase, human trafficking is a public health issue. And this initiative is an example of what that means and what our efforts within a public health arena can do towards building our response and prevention for human trafficking. So first, I'm going to give you the context about Minnesota. So Minnesota has long recognized human trafficking and sexual exploitation as human rights violations and public health issues. In 2009, we passed our Safe Harbor law, which really fostered this public health approach to human trafficking in Minnesota because it housed our response within the Department of Health. But we do this in partnership with the Department of Human Services and Public Safety. And now the Safe Harbor system is a multi-state agency approach to redirecting sexually exploited youth from prosecutions and into services, while still working with our partners to ensure that traffickers and sex buyers are held accountable. And this is done in a few ways. The Department of Human Services and Public Safety oversees specialized housing, child protection efforts, and law enforcement responses. While the Minnesota Department of Health Safe Harbor program has become the backbone of Minnesota's human trafficking response, collaborating with these efforts, but then also overseeing a network of specialized services, regional coordination, tribal partnerships, protocol implementation, as well as creating and supporting statewide training and prevention education efforts. Okay, so that's really the Minnesota context. Next, I want to nestle this Minnesota Student Survey Data Initiative within a public health approach. Because for me, a key takeaway is that you don't actually need to have a Safe Harbor program or even a human trafficking prevention program in your health department to be able to take a similar action. While Minnesota may be unique in its placement of Safe Harbor coordinator in the state health department, other health departments can play this similar vital and practical role in facilitating collaboration or informing policy, funding, and growing data collection. So for those of you not directly associated with public health, a public health approach focuses on collecting and using best available data to understand the scope of any problem, and then building a response and a primary prevention efforts with that data to address the problem. The Violence Prevention Programs Unit that is at the Minnesota Department of Health, as a whole, we're really committed to using and developing the best available empirical evidence on sexual violence, exploitation, and human trafficking, and then using that to guide our work. And this means for us, it means looking to see what existing statewide efforts already are in play that we can use to gather data. And this includes the Minnesota Student Survey. The MSS, or the Minnesota Student Survey, is a survey that's implemented by a multi-state agency committee, including the Departments of Education, Health, Human Services, and Public Safety. And it's given to students in grades 5, 8, 9th, and 11th every 3 years. And it includes questions about behaviors, health, relationships, school exchanges, and just experiences in general, including experiences of violence and harm. And this student survey provides an excellent opportunity to obtain empirical data directly from high school students. But I want to put in a caveat that as we're going to examine this data and talk about it in data, we always want to remember that we're really addressing the real world needs and experiences of young people in our state. So this data is the lives and experiences of real kids. So 3 years ago when I first joined MDH, I saw and I learned how other areas of public health gather vital information through surveys such as the MSS. And as a unit, we discussed what questions already existed about sexual violence, and we realized that there was no question about sexual exploitation. And it became our goal to engage in what is a rather lengthy process to ensure that our issues were captured and addressed by this public health tool. So both the Sexual Violence Prevention Program and the Safe Harbor Program engaged in a parallel process to develop and provide support for the revisions and new questions that could make our work stronger across the state. The Sexual Violence Prevention Program, they examined the existing questions on sexual violence, determined that they needed revisions. So they engaged a significant process of research and stakeholder engagement to identify those revisions and share them with the MSS committee. The team did a really wonderful job, and we will be analyzing the findings from this 2019 data with regards to sexual violence prevention in the coming months and separately. We also turned to filling the gap that existed with regards to sexual exploitation and adding a question to the 2019 MSS on sexual exploitation for grades 9th and 11th. This too was a process of research, field testing, and expert engagement. And because Minnesota is often on this forefront of the work, we had less to guide us along the way. So we're sort of feeling our way along. The results of this effort were shared with the Multi-State Agency Committee that oversees the implementation of the Minnesota Student Survey. And I really want to take a pause to thank them for being brave and supporting this effort, because without them choosing to add the question and the revisions that we suggested, we really would not be in this place where we can benefit from the new data that we're discussing today. So as Minnesota citizens, I ask you that any support you can give to the Minnesota Student Survey in your own school district, please do that. Sometimes they have an uphill battle for these questions and issues that are so important to our work. So the new question added to the Minnesota Student Survey represents this multi-state agency collaboration, and the analysis that came after the question was added represents the strong health department and academic partnership. We're all sort of working together to make things better for our Minnesota youth. So through these efforts and the partnerships mentioned, Minnesota is the first state in the nation to estimate the prevalence of sexual exploitation amongst high school age young people. So this is important for us to have. It's not just a goal and then there and done. It's really important to have this information because it lets us know the scope of the problem and makes it clear that we have to continue to raise awareness about sexual exploitation of youth. We need to renew and improve our efforts to reach and empower young people to navigate the difficult situations that we know that they encounter as they grow up. And while we are doing this, we also are focusing on continuing to create the cultural conditions of healthy development, respect, and safety. So our commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Health noted that we also see this new data as important in the context of overall health and mental well-being in our high school students. The most recent data from the 2019 Minnesota Student Survey included an alarming trend of decreasing mental well-being amongst our high school students, with the number of students reporting long-term mental health, behavioral, or emotional problems increasing from 2016 to 2019. And we know that sexual exploitation is part of this picture because it harms mental well-being and it puts youth at risk. So it's the same 2019 Minnesota Student Survey that also included for the first time our question about whether students had traded sex in order to receive something of value. So based on this data, we estimate that at least 5,000 high school aged young people had been victims of sexual exploitation. But this really confirms what we've already known and what we hear, that this is happening in Minnesota and it's harming our young people. What we also affirmed with the data, and our researchers will be able to give you more information, is that we know that these young people have the same hopes and dreams as other young people, and that this trauma does not define them, and that their plans for the future include college, vocational school, and military, and other plans. And our goal and responsibility with this data is to create programming and use it to protect our young people and prevent these harms, and to help those who have been already victimized achieve their dreams and reach their full potential. So Minnesota, through the ongoing work of many stakeholders, we've built a strong response to trafficking and exploitation, and the Safe Harbor program is part of that system. But those efforts and all of these efforts are based on what we knew at the time. And what's exciting is that now with this data, we know even more, and we can really improve how our system responds to and works to prevent sexual exploitation. We can use this information to guide and build our programs to reach youth that we might not have been previously reaching. So preventing the next group of high school students from answering yes to this question on the next Minnesota Student Survey in 3 years really requires this multifaceted public health approach that addresses the continuum of sexual exploitation. It includes building upon and expanding our Safe Harbor system, supporting all of our youth and their families with opportunities for housing, financial security. Increasing access to these basic needs is violence, exploitation, and human trafficking prevention. Finally, we have to, through education and talking to parents and youth and teachers and communities at large, build a capacity for youth to be healthy and safe, and then hold ourselves accountable to creating a culture that has zero tolerance for exploitation. So if we really want to reduce the number of youth who are sexually exploited, we must provide students with the resources to navigate the difficult situations and build healthy relationships. And we have to provide educators and parents with those resources to respond appropriately when youth disclose. So just in wrapping up my piece, we are excited for this initiative and this data because we're able to start counting what we were not able to count before, but what we knew was happening. But the end goal is not just to have a number. The goal is to create better systems of response and ideally prevention. It is important to remember, as I mentioned before, that this data is actually a window into the lives and experiences of real people, our young people. And our youth should not have to navigate these difficult situations because people should not be asking them to. People should not be able to exploit the vulnerabilities of our youth. And we have to work to prevent these vulnerabilities in the first place. So at MDH, we're really committed to using this data to change culture, beliefs, and behavior that drive the demand for sexual exploitation. And we're also committed to working with young people to build their own capacity to reach the goals that they have identified for themselves. And so with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Dr. Lauren Martin and Barb McMorris at the University of Minnesota School of Nursing, and they'll share, get into the nitty-gritty of the findings from the study.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. I really appreciate all the context that you provided. And I also want to thank Sarah and Mikasa and the Institute for hosting this webinar. So yeah, Barb and I are going to share some information about the Minnesota Student Survey, and particularly analysis of this new question. What we're going to do in this presentation is provide kind of we're going to start with an overview of higher level findings, and then Barb is going to dive deep into some deeper analysis that she and another team member have been conducting over the past month. I also want to acknowledge that our work is funded by the Carlson Family Foundation, and we're going to be doing not just this quantitative analysis, but we're also going to be doing some qualitative analysis and community engagement, really reaching out to learn from communities most impacted, what kinds of prevention they think are going to be most important for their communities, and also thinking about what type of data is going to be most useful for them. Super quick before I jump into the presentation, I want to acknowledge that we have a team at the University of Minnesota that's doing this data analysis. So it's me and Barb, who you'll hear from in a minute. And then Nick Ryder, who's an assistant professor in the School of Medicine in the program in human sexuality, and Katie Johnston-Goodstar, who's an associate professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota, specializing in youth studies. So here's an overview of our presentation. First, I'm gonna do a little bit of background. Beatrice did a great job giving you the kind of framework in Minnesota. I'm gonna talk a little bit about prevalence and what that means and why it's been so difficult to to come up with a number before now. And then Barb's going to talk a little bit more about the Minnesota Student Survey, and we'll talk a little bit about terminology and things like that. Then we're going to share some results. We'll highlight some gaps and opportunities, and then we'll talk about some next steps that are going to happen after this. So prevalence, prevalence is a thorny issue. In this work that I've been doing for the last 15 years, one of the most common questions that I get asked by the public or really anybody is how many young people are impacted, and people want to know who is most impacted. Until now, there have been few really solid empirically based answers. But we know, as Beatrice was describing, that these answers are really important to accurately scale and direct the resources, policy, funding, and public awareness about what's really happening for young people. So why is it so hard to collect prevalence data? The biggest reason is because young people who trade sex or are sexually exploited are a hidden population. There is no list of high school students who have traded sex that we can use to sample. So we can't really do representative sampling. We know this behavior is dangerous, stigmatized, and illegal. Also, many young people who are involved might not define what they are doing as trading sex or exploitation or trafficking. These are words that we use to describe the behavior, but it might not be something that people identify with. Also, there's a lot of differences in the field about what these terms mean and how young people might be part of it. So one really good method to gather empirically grounded data around prevalence is to ask a question about sex trading or trading sex in a survey of the general population of adolescents. And the Minnesota Student Survey offers us this opportunity. So when we add a question to a general survey, what we're able to do is understand the scope and scale within the full population. And we're also able to look at how different populations might be impacted differently to really get at those intersectional experiences. I do want to add a note of very strong caution. No data source is ever perfect. There's always limitations and gaps in every data source, and the Minnesota Student Survey is no different than any other data source. We know that there are many students who are not participating in the survey for a ton of different reasons, and Barb and I are going to say a lot more about that in a minute here. But now I'm going to turn it over to Barb to talk about a few other things.
Thanks, Lauren. So I'll talk about another thorny prevalence issue to sort of introduce this idea that really Minnesota has a terrific reputation for asking very important and groundbreaking questions of students, especially on hidden groups of young people. And in 2016, the state of Minnesota was one of the first states in the nation to ask students about gender identity on the Minnesota Student Survey. Some of you may have seen this particular graphic that's showing up on the screen. But essentially, we found that 2.7% of students said yes, they identify as transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, or were unsure about their gender identity. This 2.7% of students represents one of the largest population-based samples available anywhere. And my colleagues, Marla Eisenberg, Amy Gower, and Nick Ryder, who's also a member of this research team, we were all able to look more closely at this group of transgender students and examine their experiences, behaviors, risk and protective factors, and other intersecting identities that other researchers just really haven't had the numbers to look at statistically before. So we've published a number of papers using these data from the Minnesota Student Survey, and we are in the process of updating these 2016 numbers with improved data from the 2019 survey. Next slide, please. So all this is to say that Minnesota has this terrific research and resource in the Minnesota Student Survey. It's a really amazing resource for planning, service providers, and policymakers, not to mention researchers like us. So the Minnesota Student Survey, as you've been hearing, is a surveillance system run by our state departments of health, education, human services, and public safety. It's really similar and replaces the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention conduct in other states around the nation. Essentially, the survey is conducted every 3 years, and all school districts are invited to participate. And as you've heard, the goal is to survey all 5th, 8th, 9th, and 11th graders in participating school districts. So we wind up with an enormous sample of over sometimes 170,000 students who were in the school on the day of the survey and agreed to take it. So we get these huge number of students. I do want to point out that we don't get information on students who weren't in school, and that is an important thing to point out. I also want to point out that there are smaller samples of youth who took the survey in juvenile correctional facilities and alternative learning centers available. Those aren't quite as big as the larger, the general survey. Next slide, please. So a few more details. So in 2019, 81% of school districts participated, and students from all across Minnesota filled out the survey. And let me assure you that most large school districts that you would ask me about, they did participate. So this resulted in a sample size of over 80,000 9th and 11th graders, high school students who filled out the survey, and mostly it was conducted online. Now, our secondary analysis project that we're talking about today focuses on the over 71,000 students in 9th and 11th grades who answered the new question about trading sex. And so I'll turn it over to Lauren to tell you a bit more about that question.
Thanks, Barb. So the new question that was added, and Beatrice already discussed this, but I will read it again for you. The new question is, have you ever traded sex or sexual activity to receive money, food, drugs, alcohol, a place to stay, or anything else? And based on the students that took the 2019 student survey, 1.4% of those students answered yes to that question. So I'm going to share a little bit about terminology before we dive into results. We know that terms in this arena can be really tricky and fraught. You've noticed that the Minnesota Student Survey question used the phrase traded sex or sexual activity to describe transactional sex. This was important because many youth might not identify with terms like sexual exploitation or trafficking. It also is a way for the question to describe the activity or the behavior. The Minnesota Department of Health and many people in Minnesota view trading sex as sexual exploitation, right? But because of the way the question was worded, we are not going to be using the term sexual exploitation in this presentation. From a valid research perspective, we simply can't do a a retroactive refit on the terms. We have to use the words that were part of the survey. So in this presentation and in the publications that and briefs that we're going to be producing, we're going to be using the term traded sex or trading sex to mirror the way the question was asked. Then it's up to policymakers, service providers, and advocates to decide how they view sex trading. Okay, so I'm gonna dive into some of the data here. First, here's just another look at the data. So as I mentioned, 1.4% of the students who completed the Minnesota student surveys in public high school said yes. And we used the census data to help us get a sense of about how many people this would be. So we estimate that at least 5,000 youth in Minnesota have traded sex, and that's based on the 2018 census number. I want to emphasize that we think this is a conservative estimate, and it's very likely an underestimate. There's a lot of reasons for this. First, this is a sensitive question, and it's a new question. Also, students who might be more likely to answer yes are also more likely to not be in school. So that includes young people who are homeless, young people experiencing bullying, transgender young people, people experiencing school pushout or dropout. We know this disproportionately impacts American Indian students, students of color, trans students, homeless students, and highly mobile students. Then there's also lots of other research that shows that young people who are not regularly attending school are especially at risk of being sexually exploited or trafficking. So this is a good baseline, but we do think it's likely an underestimate. There's been a lot of speculation about where geographically the sex trading happens in Minnesota. And I think there's some myths floating around that this is more of an urban problem that happens in big cities. So this map here is showing you the Safe Harbor Regional Navigator regions as of January 2020. And what you can see is that really young people across the whole state have answered yes. And in fact, some of the rural areas, particularly in northern Minnesota, particularly northwest Minnesota, have higher rates than the Twin Cities metro area. We have a lot more work to do to really figure out why and what's going on there. But I think this graphic really gives you a good visualization of where students are who are impacted by sex trading. We've also long been discussing in Minnesota the notion that boys are also involved in sex trading, and that transgender and gender non-conforming adolescents have higher rates or might be more likely to be involved in trading sex or exploitation. Just a couple notes on terminology. So cisgender is a term for those whose gender identity aligns with their birth assigned sex. And transgender describes individuals whose gender identity differs from social or cultural expectations of their birth assigned sex. So I just wanted to clarify some of the terms. And what this graphic is really showing you is that yes, cisgender boys and cisgender girls are involved and impacted by trading sex, but really the young people who identify as transgender have much higher rates, and then even young people who identify as being unsure about their gender identity also have higher rates of saying yes to this question. The Minnesota Student Survey also validates what advocates have long been saying, that American Indian and Native young people have higher rates of being exploited. Oftentimes, this kind of data isn't possible and people get left out of surveys, but because, as Barb was talking about, this is such a large sample size, we are able to really examine this issue around race and ethnicity. So, and we also see from this graph, you can also see higher rates among other people of color and people who identified as having multiple races. So I want to highlight that these disparities really need to be understood in the context of structural racism, poverty, and current day legacies of colonization and genocide of indigenous people and enslavement of people of African descent. These forces shape poverty and oppression, and they also shape the market for transactional sex. Finally, from where I'm gonna stop presenting here for a second, we've had a lot of conversation about different relevant experiences and contexts where young people might be more likely to trade sex or might be more likely to be exploited. And the Minnesota Student Survey data is really showing that youth in juvenile correctional facilities have much higher rates than the general population at 12%. Young people who indicated having been in foster care have much higher rates at 8%. Youth who indicated experiencing sexual violence had higher rates, as did people with unstable housing in the past year and those who attended an alternative learning center. So at this point, so all the slides that I've presented are also covered in a short 2-page brief that we will be sharing with you after the webinar via email. And Barb's going to share some data that she and Nick have really been looking into over the past month that goes a lot deeper than these higher level overviews. So I'm going to turn it back over to Barb at this point.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Yep, this is some new data hot off the press. So the Minnesota Student Survey does ask a few questions about students' experiences with healthcare providers. Not as many as in the past, but a few. And this slide is showing you the percentage of youth being seen by healthcare providers who are also reporting that they've ever traded sex. So for example, among youth who have ever been treated for an alcohol or drug problem, 15% reported trading sex. Among those youth who had ever been treated for a mental health, emotional, or behavioral problem, 3% reported trading sex. And I also want to just point out, we are seeing young people that are trading sex are being seen by dentists. So there is some exposure to healthcare providers among this population. Next slide, Lauren. Okay. So Lauren showed you the prevalence of sex trading among students who reported experiencing any sexual violence. And any sexual violence consists of students' affirmative responses to being the victim of sexual violence by any of the following: a relative family member, a non-relative family member, or an intimate partner. In this slide, I'm going to compare students who traded sex to students who never traded sex. And first of all, what we can see here is that 38% of students who trade sex report not being a victim. And if you click one more, Lauren, it'll bring up the students who never traded sex. So we compare 38% of students who traded sex saying they've not been a victim to 90% of students who never traded sex saying they've not been a victim. So while I ran out of time to give you more details on this topic for today's webinar, what I wanted to point out here is that it's much more prevalent for students who trade sex are much more likely to be victims of multiple forms of sexual violence. And that's probably not a big surprise. Just so that you know, students who trade sex are far more likely to be victims of intimate partner and non-family member violence than their classmates who've never traded sex. Next slide, please. Okay, so digging a bit deeper, as Beatrice noted, there are elevated rates of mental health problems and emotional distress among our young people today. And the Minnesota Student Survey is a great resource for us to learn more about the rates in those areas. So the Minnesota Student Survey asks a lot about indicators of emotional distress. And we're going to now take a bit of time to compare different rates of anxiety, suicide attempts, and non-suicidal self-injury between students who traded sex and their classmates who've never traded sex, and also dig into gender identity group differences. Next slide, please. Okay, so first on the Minnesota Student Survey, students are asked two what are called screening questions about generalized anxiety that you can read on this screen. So over the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge, not being able to stop or control worrying? I actually think a lot of people right now a lot of our readings are really high right now, given the situation. So for students who answer these questions, we can add up their responses to the two questions to come up with a cutoff for whether students report elevated scores and potentially need further diagnosis by a healthcare provider. Next slide, please. So this graphic shows, first of all, shows the overall rate of all 9th and 11th graders in the state of Minnesota who would screen positive for elevated anxiety in 2019. So 28% of all 9th and 11th graders in the state of Minnesota would screen positive for elevated anxiety. And then we can see that over half, 56% of students who traded sex screened positive for elevated anxiety, compared to only 27% of students who never traded sex. So there's a twofold difference in rates there between students who traded sex and their peers who've never traded sex. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide adds details about cisgender girls, showing that 2/3, 66% of cisgender girls who traded sex screened positive for anxiety, compared to a little over 1/3 of cisgender girls who've never traded sex. Okay, next slide, please. This slide adds details about transgender students, showing that over 2/3, 69%, almost 70% of transgender students who traded sex would screen positive for anxiety, compared to a little over half, 55% of transgender students who've never traded sex. So transgender students in general, you can see from this slide, regardless of trading sex, really are telling us they have high rates of elevated anxiety. Okay, next slide, please. This slide adds the details about cisgender boys. 40% of cisgender boys who traded sex screened positive for anxiety, compared to only 16% of cisgender boys who never traded sex. So cisgender boys are demonstrating lower risk for anxiety in general. Next slide, please. So this slide is just sort of a repeat of all the previous slides, showing the same rates for gender identity groups all at the same time so that you can compare and contrast between them. A couple takeaways from this slide. Youth who trade sex are at much higher risk for elevated anxiety than their classmates who've never traded sex. And then transgender students in particular, regardless of trading sex, are the most anxious, followed by cisgender girls who trade sex, and then cisgender boys who trade sex. Let you process that. I'll let you process that for a minute. All right, so we're going to turn to a second indicator of emotional distress in the next slide. So the Minnesota Student Survey asks students about their suicidal behavior. Here's the wording of that question that students respond to. I've calculated rates of lifetime suicide attempts by combining responses of yes in the past year and yes more than a year ago. Okay, next slide, please. So again, same setup as the anxiety slides. This slide is first going to show that the rate of lifetime suicide attempt for all 9th and 11th graders in the state of Minnesota is about 8%. And then we can see that that rate jumps to 48% of students who trade sex also report ever attempting suicide, compared to only 8% of students who've never traded sex. That's a huge 6-fold difference. Lauren's jumped to the suicide rates for cisgender girls, and you can see that over half, 55% of cisgender girls who traded sex have ever attempted suicide, compared to only 9% of cisgender girls who've never traded sex. Big, huge gaps there. Next slide, please. To look at the rates for the transgender students. Great, thanks. So this slide adds those details about transgender, showing that over 3/4, 76% of transgender students who traded sex have also ever attempted suicide, compared to a little under half, 46% of transgender students who've never traded sex. So many, many transgender students in general, regardless of trading sex, are attempting suicide. So this is really frightening and heartbreaking. So we'll click onto the next slide to look at the cisgender boys. And here we can see that over 1/3, 35% of cisgender boys who traded sex have ever attempted suicide in their life, compared to only 5% of cisgender boys who've never traded sex. So cisgender boys are demonstrating lower risks for suicide compared to other gender groups, but that's still a lot of young people to be concerned about. Okay, and we're just gonna click on the next one. This slide just shows all of those same rates of suicide attempts for gender identity groups all at once, so that you can sort of compare and contrast between them. Again, similar pattern to the anxiety slides. Youth who trade sex are much higher risk for suicide than their classmates who've never traded sex. And those transgender students, again, regardless of trading sex, are really at high risk, followed by those cisgender girls who trade sex, and then cisgender boys who trade sex. I don't know about you, but my heart really just sinks when I look at these data. So the next slide that Lauren is gonna switch to is past a year non-suicidal self-injury. So students are asked during the past 12 months, how many times did you do something to purposefully hurt or injure yourself without wanting to die, such as cutting, burning, or bruising yourself on purpose? I combined those responses of one or more times or more in the past year to create the rates on the next slide. Next slide, please. So instead of stepping you through the rates by gender identity group, because I think you've gotten it down, here are all the rates together at once so that you can compare and contrast between them. And here again, you're going to see very similar patterns that we saw with anxiety and suicide attempts. Students who trade sex are at much higher risk for non-suicidal self-injury than their classmates who never traded sex. Transgender students, look at that, 86% of transgender young people who trade sex are telling us they've participated in non-suicidal self-injury in the past year. Cisgender girls who trade sex are at risk, as well as cisgender boys. So similar patterns. And these data, they really just beg for action. Next slide, please. So despite all these risks that students who trade sex experience, they are like their classmates in many ways. And so we don't want to leave you sort of on a down note. But we want to emphasize that like all young people, students who report trading sex have hopes and dreams for their futures. And I wanted to look at some of the Minnesota Student Survey data that indicates that what young people want to do is really similar to all young people. So here's the question that students are asked on the survey. What is the main thing you plan to do right after high school? Some of them don't plan to graduate, get their GED, go to a 2-year or 4-year college or university, maybe get a license or a certificate in a career field, or attend an apprenticeship program. Some join the military, work at a job, or other things. So next slide, please. And so here's among those students who said yes to trading sex, here's what they want to do after graduation. 63% want to go get more education at a 2-year or 4-year college. 16% want to work or get career training. And 7% want to join the military. So I went ahead and anticipated that you might want to compare these students to their classmates who've never traded sex on the next slide. And so here's how they compare. And what I want to show you here is not really emphasizing differences, but to point out the similarities between those students who trade sex and their peers who don't. And so these young people are full of hopes and dreams just like anyone, and we really need to support those. And now I'm going to turn the mic back to Lauren.
Thank you, Barb. I think the data that you just shared is staggering and sobering, painful. So I'm just going to take just 30 seconds. I just want to encourage everyone to take a few deep breaths and just sit for a moment, and then we'll come back to the slide just to figure out what the big takeaways are and what are some of our opportunities. So just take a breath in and exhale. One more breath in and exhale. So as Beatrice discussed in the beginning, really the goal with this analysis, with adding this question, is to help us identify gaps in what we're doing and figure out what we can do to better serve young people. I think it's really important to remember that the Minnesota Student Survey is a window into the lives of students in high school. So it's really important that we listen to what young people are telling us. So I'm gonna just talk a little bit just to kind of wrap up. But first I wanna just highlight some of our opportunities. So the young people who completed the Minnesota Student Survey are attending high school. They are in high school. So as educators, service and healthcare providers, and advocates, we have an opportunity to find young people and connect with them. Also, young people who trade sex and are sexually exploited are in other systems. We didn't cover a lot of this data, but the Minnesota Student Survey also highlights that these young people who have said yes to this question are interacting with a lot of other professions. So again, we can find young people, we can connect with them. This data shows us that we have a lot of work to do to better support our young people, particularly our transgender young people. So what are the next steps in our project? Before the COVID-19 crisis, we were planning to do extensive statewide meetings with large groups using the World Cafe style meetings to help us connect with stakeholders and really determine what are the most important things that we need to look at in the Minnesota Student Survey for the field right now, and also to really work to uncover community-specific prevention and intervention that is indicated by these data. Obviously, we are not going to be doing that, so we had to go back to the drawing board and completely retool our plans. So we have moved all of our engagement efforts to be online. So we've launched an online survey for stakeholders to help us identify themes and data points for our continuing quantitative analysis. And we'll share that survey with you in an email after the webinar. In place of the large community gatherings, we're going to be doing online focus groups with stakeholders. And I want to be really clear, we want to talk with professionals and people who work in the field, but equally, if not more importantly, we really want to engage people with lived experience in trading sex, and we want to engage young people. So we have developed and are in the process of developing a virtual engagement plan to reach young people in online spaces in ways so they can share what's going to be most important from their perspective. And then finally, we really want this data to be useful, and we want to work with stakeholders, including people with lived experience, to figure out what are those most important community-specific prevention strategies that we should be looking at. And we also want to engage, widely across the state of Minnesota and in lots of different communities. So, just a couple of takeaways. First off, this data shows that youth in our high schools have traded sex for something of value, and that it's widespread across Minnesota. I think what you have seen through these slides and through this data is that youth who are experiencing other hardships and traumas are more likely to report that they have traded sex. So that includes homelessness, sexual violence, foster care, etc. We also know that this is having disproportional impact on different groups of young people. I think the data around suicide attempts in transgender young people highlights this and highlights that we really need to do better. Also, want to come back to young people who trade sex have hopes and dreams for their future. Trading sex, it does not define who they are, and this. We're hoping that our ongoing quantitative analysis and qualitative work will help us identify ways to better connect with young people to prevent harm before it happens. So finally, I just want to, again, we are really wanting your input. We want to know what are the questions in the field around prevalence that you want and need to know. We want to know what comparisons and what data would help you do your work better. Like I said, we'll send an email, and in that email we can include slides. We'll include the brief that we've already produced. We'll include a link to the survey. And I think I saw in the chat that somebody would like a copy of the Minnesota Student Survey. I believe we have a PDF of that that we can share, but I will let Barb answer that question. And then finally, I just, what was that, Barb? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard Barb. Anyway, I just want to wrap up and say thank you. Thank you for attending and listening. I think we have about a half hour for questions. But before we jump to questions, I just want to ask Barb or Beatrice, do you have anything else that you'd like to add at this point?
Thank you, Lauren. This is Beatrice. No, I think, you know, it's sort of some of this information, even it was new for me because the analysis is ongoing. Lauren and Barb and the team are really in the middle of digging in and pulling out new information. And so I'm also just absorbing and thinking how to pull this into our work. And, you know, and when I say our work, I'm talking about, yes, the safe harbor work, I'm talking about the sexual violence prevention work. And even within our section at the MDH, the injury violence prevention section, which houses our suicide prevention efforts and our you know, substance and opioid misuse prevention and overdose prevention. So it's expansive, it's intersectional, and thank you for sharing. I'm good with opening it up to questions unless Barb has more to add.
Oh, I'm good. I just want to thank everybody, and we really look forward to your questions.
So great. So I'm going to stop sharing screen. And Sarah, if you want to turn our videos back on, that'd be awesome. And then I see there are six questions currently in the Q&A. So let's see. I don't know if oh, there we go. Okay. So maybe we'll just take those questions as we go. The first one is, do you disaggregate by race and ethnicity for the results related to suicide? Barb, perhaps let you.
Yeah, so we are able to disaggregate by race and ethnicity about suicide attempts. We just haven't done that yet. We are going to have to watch the sample sizes of young people who trade sex and who are students from different race and ethnic backgrounds. But yes, we can do that, and we plan to.
Then the next question is there an option for youth to take this survey in any language other than English?
I don't believe so. I think right now the survey is programmed for online administration, and it is in English.
Okay. And then, are we going to share the recording and the PowerPoint slide with attendees? Yes. Sarah, do you want to add anything to that question?
Yep, absolutely. For everyone who registered, whether they were able to attend live or not, we will send out the link to the recording, and we can also send a copy of the PowerPoint. We'll be sending the survey that Lauren mentioned earlier. Was there anything else on that list? I can't remember now.
The brief.
And the brief, yes. So we'll be sending all of that out, ideally today, but at the very least by the end of this week.
Great. I can take that question about ethnicity. Yeah. All right. So, you know, the 2019 survey asked more questions about ethnicity than any other previous survey. And so we are able to get more details on students who describe themselves as American Indian or Alaskan Native. They asked a follow-up question about what group best describes you, whether that's Dakota, Lakota, other tribal affiliations, Ojibwe. We also can get information on Asian or Asian American ethnicities, Black, African or African American ethnicities, and particular Hispanic or Latinx ethnicities. So yeah, we do have that data on the Minnesota Student Survey.
I want to Oh, sorry. Maybe just jump in real quick and just clarify that that neither the University of Minnesota, nor our program specifically, are the ones who actually operate the Minnesota Student Survey. So it's if there's an effort to get it in another language, or if there's an effort to make changes, that's really a multi-state agency committee that it includes the Department of Health, other people in the Department of Health, and the Department of Education, and as I mentioned, other agencies. And so how the student survey is implemented, the questions that are included, and interacting with the school districts, et cetera, that's really the role of this other multi-state agency committee that I mentioned early on. And my unit at the Violence Prevention Programs unit worked with that committee to, and I'm just looking at one of the questions that was in the chat as far as with whom did we work to get them the MSS into the schools. The MSS is been operating in schools. That's really the operation and a whole multi-state agency committee that works and implements it. We were just operating at this point of working with that committee to get the questions, review the questions, and have some input onto a new question and the revisions that I mentioned before. But I just really want to make it clear that those are separate, that it wouldn't be, that is a separate whole implementation process that is very, very large and but really important, because as you can see, it gives us a huge amount of information in our work. And so this Minnesota Student Survey, and I'm not sure if Lauren or Barb, did you compare this with what the equivalent is for the other states that might be participating in this? Just Minnesota has a student survey, but other states might have the YRBF, the Youth Research Behavioral Survey or something of that nature. And so we can provide more information or provide some connections if you're interested in working with the committee that implements the Minnesota Student Survey separately. But I just wanted to clarify that. I was seeing some of the comments. Thanks.
Yeah, let's jump back to the Q&A and then we'll go back to the chat. But so a couple people are asking about other variables that we might include, like socioeconomic status. Barb, do you want to say anything about what the Minnesota Student Survey will allow us to do with socioeconomic status?
Right, in terms of socioeconomic status, there are a couple of questions that students are asked. One is about whether they receive free or reduced price lunch. Another is whether or not they experience periods of homelessness or needing other shelter. There's also a question about food insecurity, about going without food. So yes, there are those questions about socioeconomic status. I see a question about disaggregating by race and ethnicity related to the TGNC students. Yes, we are able to disaggregate by race and ethnicity for transgender students. Is the survey only available online? I think right now the survey is administered to students in the schools primarily online. If a student does request a hard copy, I believe they're able to do that, but primarily they are administering it online. There's a question about the data that mentions alternative schools. Are there more details? Most of them all are alternative high schools. I don't have the exact identifiers. That is something that the multi-state sector could answer more questions about. There are online reports by county, by school district, by alternative high schools and juvenile corrections that we can direct you to so that you can get a little bit more more information about those. If a student has if a student has a disability or has difficulty reading or accessing an online survey, are there accommodations in place to assist them? I don't know that the answer to that question. That I imagine is on a case-by-case school basis. Are there any information based on students who are or have parents that are immigrants? We would love if folks would advocate to put that question on the survey. Right now, there is no questions about first generation, second generation, or immigrant status. So please go to bat and ask for that question to be added to the survey. Follow-up, will there be a move in the future to provide the survey in other languages? I think yes. I think, again, that's something that you can play a role in advocating for, to be more inclusive around having the Minnesota Student Survey provided in other languages. Do you know if charter schools take the student survey? Yes, they do. I think around 25 or so took the student survey. Is there any data on private school attendees, or are they not required to conduct it? Private schools are not sort of required to conduct it. I think if they do want to participate, they are happy, they're happily invited to. I did see a couple of private schools noted on some of the online reports. You can access reports for school districts and for these schools online.
So we have a question in the chat, which thanks us for the work. And this person wants to know, what surprised you the most in the data findings or stood out to you the most? And do you see pathways for how we might best use findings for improving responses? Maybe I'll start. I mean, I was not surprised that there were people who said yes to this question across the whole state. I think people who work in this field know that this is happening in all across the state. The transgender, the extremely disproportionate negative impact of things that's happening in the lives of transgender youth is staggering. You know, we knew it was an issue from advocates and stakeholders and others, but seeing the numbers, there's no other word for it other than staggering. I don't know, Barb and Beatrice, if you want to add anything.
I think, you know, for me, it was just being able to get a grasp on the numbers and knowing that it was a, you know, underrepresentation of possibly the reality. And, you know, just a little point about the language of the question itself. We did test run language that would have been more specific using the legal language of trafficking, but the goal was to also take a step back and look at, you know, prevention efforts and how we can intervene ahead of time before it, and so just knowing that there's this amount already happening and that we're not even really capturing everybody because of the limitations, because we know that this only operates in schools and those issues that Lauren mentioned in her study. And so just understanding that these aren't just numbers, that these are the experiences of young kids in the schools that are saying yes and that aren't getting the survey or that aren't checking that box because of other reasons. And just trying to figure out how can we expand the reach of our programming to some of those youth that we haven't, maybe it's obviously showing us that as good as we're trying, we're not reaching some people. And so how do we develop and change our programming and who we fund and those decisions so that we can make sure that we're reaching the people that are saying yes to this question.
Barb, do you want to add anything about what was most surprising?
I would just reinforce just the disparities, especially for the transgender young people. I've done some work with that, but their risk, and so.
So I I think Barb is
I
freezing.
don't know if I,
Yeah.
does that help?
That's better. Go ahead.
Yeah, having internet problems, of course, today. So I won't talk very long. I'll turn off my camera. Just again, just to reinforce the really the great risk that transgender students who trade sex are experiencing.
And I'll just reiterate some things, building on something that Beatrice just said. From the most recent Wilder research evaluation of the Safe Harbor programming, we know that Safe Harbor is mostly reaching cisgender girls. So we know there's a gap there. In terms of the number of people who've been served, it's a huge number of young people, but what our work is showing is that we haven't even come close to actually serving the true number of young people who need services. So I think there's evidence there for expanding funding, for making a case for that, that there's young people that are not yet being served. And like Beatrice said, this work can help us highlight young people who are in particular need of appropriate services and supports. I'm gonna head over back to the Q&A. It looks like there's a number of questions.
Lauren, if I can interrupt real quickly, we have a couple of questions that were up further in the chat that got lost.
Oh, please, yeah.
We had someone asking if they would be able to share these slides as long as they cite their source. That's a yes.
Oh, yeah, no, what I'll say is, yeah, we can format the slides.
Yep. Okay. And then someone had asked what potentially might fall under the category of other in that question about plans for after graduation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Barb, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, we can go back to that slide.
You want me to share screen or?
If you could go back to that slide, I think it's the slide that shows the question.
Yep, I'll share my, let me just go to that one, then share my screen real quick here. Sorry, just take me 1 second to get back there.
Thank you.
Sure.
So for that particular slide, I combined responses across the different options. Yep.
Okay.
So the other response is going to be the other response, of course, but also included in the other graphic is I don't plan to graduate and I'm going to get my GAD. So if you want to click down one more.
Okay, well, sorry, let me get my slide thing set up here correctly. Okay.
Yeah, so here's the rate. So everything under that other category is that 14%.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Should I stop? Should I stop?
Yep.
Stream? Okay.
Please.
Okay. Looks like we have a question about locational analysis. Barb, do you want to, I mean, I think.
Is there any locational analysis, school district wise? You know, the caveat about location is that we just have the location that students are attending school. And so that is just a caveat. So when we look at the rates of sex trading by location and we designate, that is determined by where the school is located. So this is students who are attending schools in rural, urban, suburban schools. And we're not able to identify the schools in the data. You'd have to get permission to do that, to do some specific locational analyses.
And it looks like someone's asking a question about should these results be taken in consideration of the current COVID crisis?
So these particular data were collected in the spring of 2019, so last spring. I don't know if the person asking the question wanted us to get into any more details. But no, the data are relevant to 2019.
Yeah, I think the question was more, can we think of implications from the data for the COVID?
I think, just similar to what we're doing across the various programs at MDH and specifically within our violence prevention programs unit, is just thinking of new ways. How do we do prevention in the time of COVID, really? How, when we have prevention and intervention responses are based on interaction and being with people, how can we do those efforts with the restrictions that are in place and with the cautions that now need to be taken place, and using the tools. We know young people are already very savvy on technology and social media, and so how can we raise their expertise up to lead us and help us to maneuver as we're trying to catch up and doing this type of technological interaction. And it's just changing the scope a little bit and being creative, I think, in how do we reach this. What we are concerned about is that the MSS gives us this insight into these lives of students. And as Lauren said, they are students, they're still in school. It's a huge opportunity for us to engage with our school systems and the support and give the school administrators and educators and social workers, et cetera, tools. But now with the students not being in school, we're losing that access or that interaction in a way that would be potentially have that insight into a student's life who needs that extra support or needs an outreach. And so I think we just have to, we have to consider this data and the findings and those who are at risk and continue to highlight how are we going to reach them, since we're losing some of those traditional means for now. Hopefully the schools will open up again, but we'll see.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and Sarah, I don't know if you want some time for wrap up. It looks like we really just have a couple questions left. Some are technical, and I might ask Barb to jump on. Is there a way for homeschooled children to access the survey? And is there a way to measure the demographics of students actually taking the survey to the general population?
So, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
So I would imagine if you have homeschooled children that you would contact the Minnesota Department of Education and ask how you can get access to the survey. Is there any way to measure the demographics of students actually taking the survey to the general population? What you can do is the Minnesota Department of Education does post demographic characteristics of all the students in the state. And you can compare those to what students are reporting in the way of demographics. What you need to remember is those are different data slightly, because data that the Department of Education has comes from school records, which presumably comes from parents checking off what race or ethnicity or what sex or gender the young person is when the student enrolled, versus the Minnesota Student Survey is asking the students to self-report that information. And so that information sources aren't going to match, as you know. So you can get a little bit more information that way, but it's not the exact same data. Do you have any data about the parents or legal guardians of these young people? The Minnesota Student Survey does ask for students to talk about how close or connected or whether they can talk to parents or guardians about problems. But other than that, we don't know much more other than just the young person's perceptions of their relationships.
Thank you. So looks like it's about 12:25.
I'm not seeing any additional questions in the Q&A, but if they come in, we will grab them before we log off here. I want to say thank you to all of you for presenting today. This is really important information. When this data first came out, I know myself and a lot of us who are working with exploited and trafficked youth were thrilled to finally have kind of a visual representation of something that we've anecdotally known to be true, but have not really been able to prove with data. This has been extremely helpful. The correlations and some of the things, particularly related to emotional distress, again, are things that we kind of inherently knew, but to actually see those numbers is really staggering, and says a lot about the work that we need to do with our young people. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, we will be sending out the recording, the slides, the survey, and the handout on the MSS data to you by the end of this week. All right, it looks like, okay. Yep, and people, I believe, Lauren, you said you'd be reaching out to folks about that focus group then. Is that part of the survey, did you say?
Yeah, in the survey, you can indicate if you would like us to contact you for further input. And the survey, I'll just say, is very brief. It's literally, it's like 10, 11 questions. And we're really just asking, what are the things that, given the scope of what's in the student survey, what are the things that you would like us to look at for our analysis?
All right. I'm not seeing any additional questions. Please feel free to contact myself or any of the presenters if you do have follow-up questions. There's a lot of really good data about the student survey on the Department of Education website. It'll tell you a lot more, and you have the ability to go in there and break down data for yourself and look at some of the responses in your community, which I would really recommend you do. It's really interesting information. All right, presenters, is there any last comments or words for people?
No, just I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, and again, we are excited to be able to use this data, but we're really excited to be able to hear from people on the front line who are doing direct work with youth, and you know, what is useful, what is it that would help you do your work, and help us engage. So thank you.
Yeah, I would just say thank you very much for attending. We look forward to more opportunities to connect. I'm sorry that we're in this era of COVID and that we're not able to connect in person for much of what we wanted to do, but I know we're going to be able to get the work done that we had envisioned doing, that we think the state really needs. So thank you very much.
Thanks all. Appreciate all the data related questions, and good luck with the rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.